Hi, I'm Karen Rice, and I would just like to talk about a subject which I'm sure we're all familiar with when we've got a painting that doesn't go quite right. And all you want to do is either tear it up or bin it. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I got to this stage, and then I'm going to show you how I rescued it really from the bin. So I really hope you find it helpful. Let's get started. So I was all excited about this. I've actually painted this photograph before, and the tutorial of this can be found in the link in the description below. But I wanted to paint this in a lot more of an abstract style using all of my yummy techniques. I've framed out the top right hand corner to protect the light, and I'm spritzing the surface of this hot press paper, 300 grams, with my spritzer bottle. I'm going to be painting wet in wet, and you see I've used framing tape around the edge, but you can use masking tape. As you can see, I'm using Brusho, Ost Blue and Violet, and I'm just sprinkling this onto the wet surface. Remember, with Brusho, less is more, so a little tap goes a long way. And if you want to know more about Brusho, I'll put a link for that in the description below. So what I'm doing now is I've mixed up some yellow and a little bit of phthalo turquoise, just a touch, using my size 10 brush and painting wet into wet, all of that sort of greenery at the top there. And just with this sort of style of painting, I like to be really loose, and I like to use lots of different techniques. And just to see what happens, experiment. It's very therapeutic, and that's just what I was in the mood for. So I'm using the tip of my brush here, just using a mid green, and now I've added a little bit of burnt sienna to that green to put some darks in there, and a little bit of quinacridone gold now, wet into wet, to the right hand side for the path area there. So I'm kind of following the photograph, but as I said earlier, painting in a lot more looser style. And I'm using some burnt umber here with the green as well, and a little bit more mid-green, a little bit of the quinacridone gold. And this little palette here is from the core watercolour set that I bought a while ago, and it comes in this really nice sort of tin box, and it's great for actually mixing colours and using it as a palette. And I'm just sort of painting a very creamy green here, mid-green, the yellow with the phthalo turquoise, damp into wet here, so you've kind of got that sort of lighter green behind with this darker sort of green in front, painting the grasses as well, damp into damp, using my size 10 brush. So when I work in this style, I like to use bigger brushes, and it kind of really loosens you up, and working wet into wet really does loosen you up as well. I took this photograph a while ago, and I love the contrast with the light background with the sort of dark, but also those gorgeous little bluebells as well in the sort of left hand corner as well. I'm painting some little buttercups here. I've actually squeezed out some yellow on my surface there. It's not my dining room table, don't worry, it's just a sort of large drawing board. And but I thought not to get it contaminated, I put it down there separately away from all that green. And I'm just painting around the yellow here as well. So still kind of sticking to the photograph, but as I said earlier, again, in a very loose style. So trying not to contaminate that yellow. This is grey Brusho, and I'm just tapping this onto the wet surface there, and a little bit into the left-hand corner as well. So you can see how useful this framing tape is, protecting it from all the Brusho and the spattering, etc. I'm using the twig here just to scratch into the surface of the paper. Remember, this is permanent. So if you don't want to do this, you could actually use a watercolour pencil, black or dark brown, or you could paint that wet on dry later. So I'm just sort of sketching in a little bit of details with the twig, using some of the paint, or scratching into the surface of the paper. I love using a twig. It really does free you up. And remember, this is just a twig from the garden that I've sharpened with a pencil sharpener. And I'm just sprinkling a little bit of table salt onto the surface. And now I'm using my watercolour pencils. I think it's a little bit of a green with a sort of an emery board there. You can use sandpaper as an alternative. Scrubbing the watercolour pencil onto the emery board so the pigment falls onto the wet surface, creating a nice texture, and it's a lovely substitute to Brusho. And I'm also using the watercolour pencil to create some marks and textures as well. And just to say, the salt absorbs the watercolour paint And when you allow it to dry naturally, it creates some lovely light texture effects as well, like little wildflowers. I'm just painting a little bit of dark just beneath that tape there, because I really want that contrast of dark and light there. So using a little bit of ultramarine and yellow, any dark will do, a bit of Paynes grey and yellow, and just sort of creating a little bit of texture here by spattering some water, quite a good alternative to salt as well. What I'm doing now is I'm peeling off the framing tape to reveal this lovely light area. And the painting is still wet, and I'm using a large round brush here just to sort of paint some quite pale washes in the distance here. I'm not trying to really represent what's there. I just want to create sort of a little garden or a little bit of a wilderness beyond there using these pale colours. The colours that I've really used in the foreground. So I'm just sort of painting wet on dry here, using some of the greens, some of the quinacridone gold, mixing up some darks here as well, just to create a little bit of contrast to the right hand side. You've got some bushes to the right hand side as well here, and just painting that damp into damp. And I'm using a Swordliner brush here, which is quite nice because it's the brush hairs are wider at the bottom and thin like a rigger at the top, so it sort of creates these lovely marks. It's great for painting leaves and also twigs. So you can see I've got some lovely thin lines there, and what I'm doing now is I am spritzing that as well to soften those marks and washes, and again using some table salt and a little bit of Brusho to create some sort of textures and colours there as well. So, you know, I'm using all the techniques, and I'm actually having lots and lots of fun, really enjoying this painting and believing that everything is going right. You know, not for 1 minute did I think this painting was not going to quite work out. So I'm tilting here and I'm using my twig to sort of pull out some marks. I'm not really scratching in, but using the wet paint to create some sort of thin sort of tree trunks and smaller trees in the distance here. And I really love doing things like this, and tilting sometimes can sort of create random effects. And I'm spritzing again just to soften this side here. I felt it was a little bit dark, so I'm just going with my instincts and playing and spritzing and tilting here as well, letting all the paint run down. I love the way that Brusho's got a lovely light and colour to it there, and I'm spritzing the damp foreground here as well, again to soften things and push them back a little bit, and just taking off all of the excess damp paint and allow my painting to dry naturally. But once the painting was dry, I didn't feel very inspired by the painting. I felt I'd lost it really, and I didn't really want to go on working with it. So I thought I'll get my L-shaped mounts out and try and find a magical work of art within there. Hopefully I'll find one. So that looked quite nice. And the thing with the L-shaped mounts, it was actually a 12 by 16 mount, and I cut the corners in, so it's in two pieces, and you can adjust the size to see if there's a painting that's worth working on further and that inspires you to go on working. This also works really well on finished paintings when you feel that you've lost it. When you use the two L shapes, you can actually find a little gem sometimes, which has really surprised me. So what I've decided to do is to divide the painting into two. So this is quite drastic, but I wasn't prepared to go on with this. So, you know, why not just experiment and see what happens? So I've cutting it in half because I quite like the right hand side, and I felt quite inspired to go on with that one and maybe just discard the left hand one. So here is the right hand side. So I really am still inspired by that light in the distance, which my original idea was to create that light against dark. So I'm mixing up some creamy dark paint here, using a little bit of sepia and a touch of the phthalo blue for a really dark green. I'm using a natural sponge. I've rinsed it under the tap, wrung all the water out, and I've tapped it into that creamy dark paint. I'm just tapping it very gently onto the right hand side because I really want to create that dark against light. I'm using that Swordliner brush with a dark wash here, touch of violet, touch of burnt umber, and I'm painting some branches here in the foreground just to create a little bit of interest. Excuse my hand. And now I'm spattering some yellow onto this damp surface with my size 8 brush just to create some light and interest there as well. and I'm sponging again some more dark just on top there. So really building up the textures and the tonal values here to really pull this away from the distance there and create more darks. And I'm painting some sort of mid-tone and darker grasses in the foreground as well. So this really creates some depth in my sort of semi-abstract painting. I'm also doing this with little sort of stones in the foreground here, using that sort of dark violet with burnt umber there to create some interest and again texture and dark, so it pulls this forward, pushing the background away. And I'm spattering some of these marks as well with my size 8 brush. I've mixed up some ultramarine and permanent rose here, and I'm sort of using the tip of my brush to paint some distant bluebells as well, also in the sort of middle distance here, just to create a little bit of interest. That was the other thing that attracted me about this photograph, was the gorgeous little bluebells. I love a bluebell. I'm spattering some white here as well with my size 8 brush. I've actually got a little touch of pink and ultramarine mixed in there, so it's quite a pastel colour. So sometimes when you've lost your light, you can add white paint or white gouache to your watercolours to kind of rescue your painting. It really does help if it looks a little bit dull and a bit flat and where you've lost your light. So I'm spattering some of this sort of pastel violet colour here and there. And I've mixed up some Paynes grey and yellow here, painting sort of almost damp into damp. It could be wet on dry with my size 8 brush, really to create that dark that really pulls it away from that distance. And I'm also doing the same with a sponge, sort of sponging on very gently this Paynes grey and yellow, really to sort of be so bold with the darks here, to really pull it forward, to exaggerate it. So I'm painting with my Swordliner again, some of this sort of little bit watered down Paynes grey with a touch of burnt sienna, and I'm painting the sort of trees in the distance, wet on dry, and you can see those paler trees in the distance that I painted earlier before I cut the painting in two. So it actually creates a bit of depth in the distance here, and I will give you a little close-up so you can see that better. It's so effective, and it actually creates depth and atmosphere. I'm just using the side of the brush here, the Swordliner, to create some texture just in front of those distant trees. They're using some of that dark green. I thought that was a little bit too dark. Remember, I'm experimenting, so I'm just diluting a little bit and softening back those marks and lines. What's really nice about this style of painting is you can try things out. You can practice your watercolours, and hopefully that will build confidence. So I'm just painting some thin lines here in the foreground. The paint has dried off a little bit. Again, excuse my hand, but that's a bit of Paynes grey there. And I'm spritzing now the foreground. I felt everything was a bit too dark and textured, so I'm just going to soften the foreground here by spritzing, not touching it with a brush or anything, and letting it all run down at an angle here, just to soften all that and just take all the excess paint off with a paper towel. So I'm spattering some white gouache. You can use white watercolour paint with my size 10 brush, just where really that light in the distance is kind of my focal point. So I want to sort of add a bit of interest up there to draw your eye in. But there's almost like a path from the sort of bottom right hand corner all the way. It's like a zigzag all the way up to those distant trees there, which I quite like. So I'm removing my framing tape now to reveal the white border to see if I need to do any more. And I've decided to work more on those distant trees. So I'm turning my painting upside down. The reason why I've done that is because I just find it easier to paint sort of the detail of sort of trees like this upside down. So you're painting towards yourself rather than away. It's just easier on the arms. And so here I'm just adding a little bit more dark to these trees with my size 2 brush. So I'm going to turn my painting around the right way again, just to have a look to see if I need to do any more. And I thought it'd be quite nice to actually sponge some of that pastel colour I mixed up earlier to show some light bluebells in the distance, which I thought would be quite a nice way to finish off this painting. But I couldn't resist one last spatter of some yellow here, just reminded of those buttercups in the photograph. So I've just sort of spattered that in the foreground there, rinsing my brush off, and I'm going to spatter a little bit of limey green now as well in those sort of trees to the left and right there, just to create some light and texture here and there. A little bit more white added to that limey green. That's the yellow mixed with the phthalo turquoise. I just can't resist a spatter. I almost need someone to tell me to stop at this stage as well, but it is so much fun. And the first painting I ever sold was one that I used so much spattering on. I was so delighted. So that's probably where it comes from. So I'm using the L-shaped mounts again just to kind of check to see if I need to do any more, but I'm much more satisfied with this painting and really pleased that I did cut it in half to sort of rescue it in a way. So I really hope you found this helpful. And I was so inspired by the results of that painting that I decided to work on the other half, the one that I was actually really going to bin. And here is the finished painting. And a link for this tutorial will be available Tuesday, the 5th of April, 2022. But I was delighted to paint these gorgeous cornflowers on that abstract background. So instead of binning my original painting, I ended up with 2 paintings that I was pleased with. So I really hope you found this tutorial helpful, and that instead of binning your painting, maybe you may find 2 paintings out of it, or just find a section of the painting that you feel inspired to work with. So if you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. For those of you that would like to learn more about watercolour, get access to exclusive tutorials and support my YouTube channel, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about that can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.